A few years ago, we discussed an issue which is currently in the forefront of the news. Please enjoy this prior episode, and please visit our website at conversationsacrosstime.com. Thank you.
Conversations across time, 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 conversations across time.
Stable leader
So
provides
President Putin
stability
is
to
no
a
different
nation.
than President Eisenhower and President Kennedy and President Clinton in terms of supporting immoral leaders.
Right. Well, that's the whole point. They supported it because of the balance of power that we discussed before. It was only when we got leadership like Bush and now Trump, who don't understand what that's all about, then you run into problems.
Was it Bush or was it Cheney?
Bush made the order, but it was Cheney in his ear, and the other neocons. And by the way,
but
those same people are back.
I was just going to point that out to you. When you say there's no interest in your country, the United States, and in Syria, the same people are now around the idiot, as he called him, and since it was the title of my book, I'm going to keep using it. He called him the idiot, surrounding himself with the same people. So
Exactly.
why are you so certain that they won't intervene in Syria?
Well, I'm not suggesting, well, I don't think they will, but the point is this, that this is only temporary, as you know. I mean, it's not like Russia where Putin will just keep re-electing himself over and over and over again. That's not going to happen here.
That's not going to happen with Assad?
It's not going to happen with 45. There's going to be a 46, and it's not going to be him, and it'll be different. I'm sure of that, and that's what we're banking on. And this is temporary, and hopefully, saner people will prevail, and they won't get involved here. We'll see what happens.
May I point out that before the so-called Arab Spring, Mr. Assad provided a stable government. That's all my government needs, is a stable government to place its investments for our capitalists, if you want to call them that. That's all we need. And any upheavals, such as what the Arab Spring, that just simply broke down the regime, the nation just.
So Secretary Dulles, you would have advised the idiot not to retaliate against Syria when he accused them of using chemical weapons, right?
That's not. You don't really know that they use
I'm asking you
weapons.
I'm asking you what you would have advised him then.
I would have. Yes, there's a dilemma.
Well, now let me ask while you're thinking about that, because I just want to interject a couple of things. In 1979, when Israel and Egypt aligned themselves, Egypt used to be the ally of Syria. So Syria was pretty much left out in the cold in 1979. Now, there had always been a relationship between Syria and Russia, but the relationship got even stronger when they could no longer depend on Egypt. I'm just saying, I don't understand how people that are at the higher levels of government and making policy decisions don't read a map. Why would you think that you would not expect Syria to retaliate in some way when they no longer have an ally in Egypt? Because Egypt is now in line with Israel. Because you guys are the ones that make these decisions, and I know that wasn't a decision that you made, but it does seem in keeping with the American policies as we talk about geopolitics.
How the Syrian government handles its affairs. I'm not in the Syrian government, madam, so I have no way of ascertaining how their logic.
Let me just say
We
this.
go back, the Mother Russia was the first country to recognize Syria's independence. So we have,
1946.
we have more at stake there than any other power in the world. And the United States should just back off, get out of the Middle East.
And so your nation could intervene. Again, your imperialism is therefore superior to our so-called
We made
imperialism.
far less mistakes in the Middle East. And the biggest mistake we made was Afghanistan. Other than that, our policy in the Middle East has been pretty solid.
What about your policy?
Yes.
You made the
Russian policy.
Russian
same
policy.
mistake in Afghanistan that we did, by the way. It's the same.
Yes, yes.
The
And
point
they
is,
were happy for us to jump into the void because they could wash their hands of Afghanistan.
if it were not for Israel, by the way, I think the United States would be backing out of the Middle East right now.
Altogether?
Just about, yeah, I think so. But that's not, Israel's there, and of course we're bound to support Israel, the only real democracy that's in the Middle East, and we'll continue to do that. But to what extent is subject, of course, to the future. Who knows what they're going to do.
Well, one of the things that
Well,
you
one of the
mentioned-
things that happened, I think, in terms of your politics and why you got the idiot, is because I think the candidate that ran against them, Mrs. Clinton, was going to try to force the great Putin out of the Ukraine and Crimea, and she was going to take a hawkish position, and that is critical to the Russian geopolitical goals. So we truly believe that
Well, would that
anybody but her, and I think that Putin believed anybody but
So
her.
that would explain what is going on right now in
Right.
terms of the investigation.
Exactly.
And in terms of why Russia would have an interest in ascertaining that Mrs. Clinton never become the president of the United States. Secretary
Women
Clinton-
have no
that-
business in public affairs anyway, so
But the bottom line is President Putin supported the idiot because anybody but Ms. Clinton.
Right.
Now,
I think that's pretty clear.
and Mr. Dostoevsky, yeah, I agree with you, and I think that
And I think when the investigation is completed, by the way,
Yeah.
that'll definitely
It'll
be a
show that.
conclusion that was the reason they did it. There's no question that they favor Trump.
And-
now,
it
I,
must-
as a person, as a woman sitting here, take exception to your statement about women in politics. But
Take
I want
away.
I want to ask you this question.
Mr.
Don't-
Dulles, though, you're very lucky that Miss Joseph is not here
Yeah.
tonight when you're saying that.
You're
doesn't
very
matter.
right.
Yeah, that's outrageous, by the way. But that's okay.
It's outrageous.
Right.
But I want to ask you, Mr. Dostoevsky, if you would enlighten our audience about the fact that Russia not only needs Ukraine for warm water ports, but Ukraine, first of all, belonged to when it was the Soviet Union, it belonged to. They were all part of the Soviet Union. And in addition to that, Ukraine is the breadbasket for Russia. I don't understand. Do you think that the Russian people should starve, that they should not have access to the foods that they need, and Ukraine being the breadbasket for Russia?
Russia mustn't think that every nation around it lives to serve its purpose.
Unlike the United States. I'm just asking.
Like I said, the Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation, as you must be well aware, Mr. Dostoevsky, and it doesn't exist to provide bread for your table. You can grow your own wheat, I'm sure.
Frozen land.
Excuse me?
On frozen land. I'm just saying to you that the only way we get to have any solutions to these situations is we've got to understand the other person's position. It's any debate that you get in, you need to understand where the other person is coming from.
The
I'm
United
not
States
sitting here
also has its
defending-
needs too, you know.
I'm not sitting here defending Putin by any stretch of the imagination. I'm simply saying that he is doing what makes the most sense for the interests of Russia.
Yes,
Having a
and
warm water port in Ukraine and also in Syria, and also having access to a way for his countrymen to eat. That's their breadbasket. It's like you saying you're going to take the Midwest from this country, and then we have to rely on imports for food.
Yes, and as you know, we have our disagreements, Ms. Crawford, and the fact, but I have devoted a lot of my public career to the well-being of the United States, and quite frankly, it distresses me that the Republican Party that I have grown up in and our own president saw the need to go to an outside power, such as Mr. Dostoevsky's Russia, to attain support to interfere in our elections.
Well,
A great nation does not allow that. I have always wanted America to be a great nation. How did we get to this? Even from the grave, it distresses me.
You are the biggest hypocrite that I've ever heard. Are you sitting here and telling this distinguished panel and our audience that the United States never interfered in democratic elections in countries to bolster up the election of people favorable to the United States, or to depress an election where a communist might win? And are you going to sit here and tell us that your CIA did not assassinate or have leaders assassinated when it was in the interest in your own country? How dare you criticize any country for meddling in an election that would affect its own self-interest, when you are as guilty as any other country in the world in history of doing the same thing?
Everything I have done has been toward the interest of the United States.
Mr.
Well,
Dole,
I would say the same thing about dear Mr. Putin and the interest of Russia.
I want to just ask one question, because Secretary Dulles, this is something that you were directly involved in, and I know that our audience is probably know before the words get out of my mouth what I'm getting ready to ask about, and that is the reason that we are having so many problems in the Middle East has to do with right now. It's hard for me to call him President Trump, so I'm just going to call him 45. Right now, 45 is talking about literally ripping up the deal with Iran. He's talking about ripping it up because we didn't get enough. But Iran had a democratically elected leader. And you know this, and it is to your shame, and it is part of your history, that the democratically elected leader of Iran, and I believe 1954, somehow it's the year that comes to mind, that at the behest of British Petroleum, your brother at the time was the head of the CIA, and you guys orchestrated an overthrow of the democratically elected president and reinstated the Shah of Iran. There would never have been the uprising in Iran that happened in what was it, 1978, 1979? That never would have happened. Those folk determined that they wanted self-rule, and they knew that the Shah was simply a puppet of the United States. And puppet of the United States, but a puppet of Western oil interests. So that there was this uprising, and then comes the Ayatollah, which, as Irv just explained at the top of the show, that the Ayatollah, Iran is a Shia nation, and therefore the Ayatollah, even though now they might have a titular head of state, the Ayatollah is the one that makes the determinations, because through his descendants as a Shia, as therefore being in direct lineage to the Prophet Muhammad.
It's infallible because
he's infallible. So
direct line to God.
Direct line to God. So that we are never going to affect any rational conversation with a people who believe that their leader talks to God.
That's why I opposed, as when I lived, I'm a strong religious Catholic of the Eastern faith, That's why I oppose Roman Catholicism, because they believe the same thing in the infallibility of the Pope, and it's the same kind of mental state. And as long as that happens, there's no hope, and they're absolutely right. It was your policy and your brother who was the head of the CIA.
That gave us the confusion that we have in Iran today, but also it's further exacerbated by the fact that in order, once the Ayatollah came to be in control and we didn't have our influence, Western influence in Iran, that Western interests propped up Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was a little known military person, but he became the leader that we supported because we had to make certain that we could preserve our interests in the Middle East. So that's where Saddam Hussein came from. He was our creation.
It was our proxy.
He was our proxy, which is what we're talking about
Right.
now with Syria. Is Syria a proxy for Russia?
We made a deal with the devil, which wasn't the first time we've done that, by the way.
Yes.
But it was in the United States' interest to do so. Now, the situation in Iran, and of course it's coming up now because of this agreement that the United States signed on to. I don't think that this administration knows what can happen if they get out of this agreement. I'm sure that Iran will say, okay, well then we're free to go ahead and build our nuclear weapons. Does that mean that the United States is then going to go to, because the only other option, of course, to stop them from getting nuclear weapons would be to go to war. And of course, with surrounding himself with these neocons, with Bolton and with Pompeo, it looks pretty clear to me that that's something that we really have to be on guard against.
One of the things that, and again, since Secretary Dulles brought it up and I wrote a book with the title, I'm going to call him Your Idiot, is part of the problem that he wants to renege on the agreement with nuclear weapons in Iran, not on policy matters, but because it was negotiated and orchestrated by his predecessor.
Obama administration.
And anything that his predecessor did, he would be against, even if it would be in the best interest of your country. So
you're right. I mean, it's a ridiculous proposition, but that's absolutely true, and that's why he did it. And that's why there is no plan B except to go to war. Now, the other thing that comes into play here is that he seems to, and Bolton and Pompeo, seem to be acting on the 2001 declaration, or 2002, whatever it was, declaration in Congress, which allows the president to go to war under emergency circumstances. Well, is there an emergency circumstance in Iran that'll allow him to go ahead and go to war without the approval of Congress? I don't think so. So Congress has to have the cojones, yeah, you know, they have to have the strength to be able to stand up to him. Up to this point, they've been going along, the Republicans anyway, have been going along with him because he can rubber stamp whatever proposals they have. This can't possibly be in the best interest of the United States to go to war in Iran and create another situation like we had in Iraq and the situation we had in Vietnam before.
Have
You know, when will we ever learn kind of thing? Is it coming right back again
right
to
back
where
around.
we discussed it from before?
And
Have you ever seen the Congress? I mean, the mental
President
capacity.
Congress?
Yeah, the current Congress or any Congress I have had to deal with. I mean, they're not the most intelligent people. I mean,
Well, one of the things
they're
that
quite
happens-
content. They're quite content to have fun with the lobbyists and take the money from the lobbyists and look like great courageous heroes in front of the cameras.
But Secretary Dulles, one of the things that when you talk about the Congress, when Irv was talking about religious extremism, talking about the Wahhabis, talking about the Hasidim, what we have in Congress is a significant contingent of what I'm trying to think of, what do they call themselves? The
Freedom
Freedom
Caucus.
Caucus, the Freedom Caucus. And it consists of evangelicals who have the same extremist notions that we look down upon. when they happen in other areas. For instance, the extremists in Iran and what that's led us to, and of course what is going on in Syria. Those are all extremist elements that are making these things happen. And that's what we're faced with in this country. But I want to make sure that you at least address the fact that there's a certain notion that the United States is acting in a moral capacity. Now, I just don't see that you have the background for that. I don't see that the United States is in position to claim that what they're doing is moral, because if so, in 1953 or 54, they would never have interceded in Iran. We wouldn't have the situation that we have with Iran because there was a democratically elected president. And in fact, Mr. Mossadegh, and we'll put up information about him, the reforms that he wanted for his people was that simply that he had no problem with Western interests in oil, but they had to pay a fair price for it because it didn't make sense for them to extract this natural resource and not pay a fair price. So then we end up with Saddam Hussein, that the neocons decide, well, we're going to create a war against him. And he was a stabilizing factor because Iran, the Iranians were afraid of the Iraqis, and the Iraqis were indeed afraid of the Iranians. So that was a balance.
But
there's no balance now.
That, in many of my novels, and one of the things I want to bring out, because I think it's important in light of the war that Bush II and the neocons got your country involved in Iraq, is the psychological factor that your President Bush II was always aware of his father in the Gulf War not going into Iraq and taking out Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War. And I think there's a psychological component that he was more receptive to the neocons because of the criticism his father got. Right, and I think that was a psychological thing that affected him. I mean, I know the neocons had their own agenda, your neocons, and your Vice President, Dick Cheney, had his own agenda, but I think psychologically, Bush #2 was psychologically open to that because of the criticism his dad got for not going in and taking out.
Well, that's exactly by the way, that's exactly the reason that history will show Bush #1 was a terrific president. And Bush #2 was a disaster.
Of this conversation, I alluded to the fact that you, as a participant, as a person who was present at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, that you essentially welched on the agreement that you had with the Sharif. Now, certain things happen.
Probably never had the intention of actually following through from the very beginning, but let's go ahead.
No, but you're right. You're absolutely right. But what happened is you encouraged Mr. Ben Ali to unite the Arabs to fight the Ottoman Empire so that it would advance the interests of Britain and the United States and France as pertains to the war that was going. That's the First World War. And at the end of the First World War, you knew that there was an agreement that it existed, that there would be a caliph, that the establishment of the caliphate would be protected. But you did not live up to that agreement. And I guess we're all sitting here trying to figure out, in hindsight, why it is that you and the Western powers felt you had a right to divvy up the Middle East along the lines that you did, because that's what led to where we are now.
That's what
We
military
were the powers.
It is extremely fascinating that he would say that my people are incapable of building a modern state when the advent of oil wealth has catapulted the entire Middle East into either explosive disarray or obscene wealth.
So that was the key element. One, destroyed the army of the Iraqis, okay, in that Kuwait invasion, and didn't go in and destroy Iraq, so maintain the balance of power. And the other one went in to show shock and awe, whatever they were going to do, and the war would be over in 4 or 5 days.
And the
war
Iraqis
lasted
were
for
welcome us
years.
in. Yeah.
And it was the worst mistake.
I also
it was
believe
an awful mistake.
I also believe psychologically there was a rumor that when Bush or Pappy Bush, as some people in your country call him, was president, that Saddam Hussein had put out a hit on him to assassinate him, and I think that also affected Bush II's thinking in terms of that. So, you know,
I'm sure they put that in his ear. He was subject to a lot of suggestion.
In many of my novels, I deal with the psychological aspects of
that's
people's
what I was
behavior, so that's why I just brought that up, even though the neocons could care less about,
But
that.
he was just an instrument that they were able to use. But I like the fact that you bring in the psychological aspect of it, because I believe that you would probably, looking at in today's climate, in today's political climate, you may look at 45 and think that there's psychological motivations for his actions.
Well, you know
Well,
what?
yeah, I wrote a novel. In fact, the title of my novel fits Your President Idiot Completely, Crime and Punishment.
Here's the parallels. The neocons, when you go back to the neocons, a lot of what they considered at the time was that going into Iraq would serve a lot of purposes, including helping Israel. They were very, very, very much pro-Israel. And we're in the exact same situation again with this super pro-Israel position. I mean, I'm in favor of being for Israel, but this position, this pro-Israel position, to get rid of all of the people around them that are, could cause them trouble, is going to cause us a tremendous amount of trouble. And I think what they're thinking of doing here by abrogating this treaty and obviously going into attack Iran must be in the headlights. I think it's really a tremendous mistake.
I have to agree with something that has been pointed out. In my work at Sullivan and Cromwell, the clients I've had were all the most wealthy and powerful corporations throughout the world. I have brokered deals for them with various foreign governments. I can assure you that I agree. They seem very entitled to do whatever they want in the world, wherever in the world.
Multinational corporations that you represent.
Yes, very much so. They couldn't care less about the feelings of the people of Iran. They
didn't care about the feelings of the people. I mean, first of all, to your credit that you're admitting this, Sullivan and Cromwell, and you specifically, represented a lot of Nazi interests during. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Come back next week to where we take up this interesting conversation, because what you realize is that there's so much going on in the Middle East, and it's so important for you to have this information. So we thank you, and please tune in next week for the continuation of this conversation across time.
Conversations across time, 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 conversations across.
Welcome to Conversations Across Time, the show that allows you, the viewer, to experience imaginary conversations between immortals, historical figures from different time periods. And so, the story begins. I am someone that's always been interested in history. So one of the things that in one of my former incarnations, I was a history teacher. And I thought that history was always taught when the kids could get interested in it and when they could have some understanding of the personalities. So I had this idea, and I was here at Philly Cam, and when I started talking about doing this show, the more people I talked to, the more people it seemed would be interested in the concept. So Babette explained to you that I saw her on a corner because Babette is a former state representative. And I knew that as a person with a feminist background and a progressive background, it would be wonderful to have her discuss things that were going on today, and we could apply it to historical instances. So what we do, what Conversations Across Time is, we take actors playing historical characters, and we have Babette and myself, and we ask them questions, and we mix the time periods. So that's why the title Conversations Across Time. So we may have Frederick Douglass having a conversation with Eleanor Roosevelt. This brings an interesting twist and it gets you to know both of those personalities. So we're very excited about this, and we try to put people together that everyone would be surprised about. So we do Thomas Jefferson and Josephine Baker.